Hi everyone, it's EK from EK Gorman Designs, and I am coming in today with a massive video that I put together for you showing crafters 20 ways to play with stencils. And at the end of the video I have, I think, 10 fully realized cards, but throughout the video I'll show different techniques you can use to utilize your stencil as much as humanly possible. Now the first thing I want to show you is how I tape down a stencil to use it. I pull out my paper, and the cool thing about stencils is you can use either side of them. Now I'm using this brand new stencil from Craftin Desert Divas called Halloween Scene Stencil. And when I use them, I just pull out a little tape and throw it on the top and the bottom. I was out of blue crafters tape, so in this case I was just using Post-it tape. Now the first technique I think most crafters naturally tend to gravitate toward is just using distressed inks and blending with a sponge the color through the stencil onto the paper. Here I've chosen six colors, and I'm just blending them through very quickly and simply into the sponge, onto the sponge, through the stencil onto the paper. And I'm just using regular cardstock. I think it's Nino 110 pound, but I'm not using watercolor paper here. I am just using a simple cardstock because I don't intend to sprinkle any water on it. The cool thing about distressed inks, as all crafters know, is if you spray water on it, you get a whole different effect. But you don't have to spray water on it. You can use just these beautiful colors on their own, blended into one another, to create this gorgeous gradiated color. And as you can see, this technique is incredibly simple to use. I think this is where most crafters gravitate toward when they use a stencil. Just some simple ink blending on. And voila, you have a simple, gorgeous background. Now I figured while we're right here, I'm going to show you how I clean my stencils. When I use something as simple as distressed ink, I use a little water and a clean paper towel, and I gently wipe the color off. That simple. And then I go back over and dry it. Now with the release of the new Distress Oxide, you have a second option for ink blending. I will warn you, I had a little video problem here, but I use the exact same technique and the exact same colors as I did with the distressed inks. I don't have blending sponges, so I've been using these makeup sponges, and they work great. The Distress Oxide has a very cool feature, though, that the distressed inks doesn't. You can use it on black cardstock. Now, the color isn't nearly as bright as it is on white cardstock. But there is no way you can use your regular distress inks to make on black cardstock and make a background. So that gives the Distress Oxides a whole different property that the inks don't have. Actually, I love the soft pastel look that the Oxides give black cardstock when you blend the ink through them. Now, back to my sponges. When I got my Oxides, I just didn't have any extra distress blending Velcro sponges lying around, and I wanted to play with my Oxides, so I just pulled out my giant handy dandy bag of makeup sponges and labeled them, put the initials of each color onto a makeup sponge, threw all the makeup sponges into a little jar, and that's what I've been using. I haven't even thought of getting a blending sponge because these work for me. I find that the Distress Oxides blend a little bit differently than the inks do. And I find that dabbing as opposed to a circular motion works better for me. If you're finding you're not liking how your blending's working with the new Oxides, try dabbing instead of circular motions. I find for me that it works much better. But look at how gorgeous the color comes out on black cardstock. And like I said, I use the exact same colors for both of these projects. Now, and I love that soft little blendy look that it has. Now, this is a technique I call ghosting. It's been around forever. I use it with the Oxides now instead of the inks. You could use both. But I just took the Oxide, the black soot Oxide, on some watercolor paper, and as you can see, just rubbed the ink on. Then I laid down my stencil, gave it a good press, or moved it around a little bit, gave it a good press down so it was really sticking to the wet ink. And then using some just clean water, that's it, clean water, I sprayed the thing and then dabbed the ink away, whatever got wet, with a clean paper towel, leaving a cool ghosting effect behind. Now, it's not going to have the crisp, clean images that, say, blending with a sponge is going to have, But that's why I like it, because it's a completely different look than just blending with a sponge or distress ink. Now, I go one step further here. I always dry off everything really good and throw my stencil right back onto the image, and I pull out spray ink and add color. In this case, I use some picked raspberry, but I just spray a little on and then dab off the extra, leaving just a little bit of color back in that area where I've taken ink off in the first place. I like the effect. I like that kind of blurred old movie feel, especially with this stamp set. Now here's one of my little extra cards you're going to get along the way. I had all this gorgeous ink on my stencil, so I just pulled out, and I made a mistake. I pulled out a piece of cardstock. I should have pulled out a piece of watercolor. Flipped the stencil over and laid down the extra ink onto the cardstock. Now, because it was cardstock and not watercolor, I couldn't move the color around. So I solved the problem with my little blotchy spots real simply. I grabbed a paintbrush and literally filled in the gaps quickly. It's a fun look. It's a different look. It gives you more options, making your stencils more usable, less scary, especially when you have a great scene stencil like this, when there's lots of things going on and you can put little critters and stamped images in front of it. You want as many different techniques as you can, so your cards don't start all looking the same. I think there's some real great variety that a stencil can give a crafter if you're willing to experiment with different mediums. And look, just a couple little coloring, you get a nice extra card. So there's the ghosted card, and then there's your extra ink card. And again, the ghosted card is a little out of focus, and that's what I like about it. And this one's a little blotchy, but if you do it right, it works. Now, since I pulled out a bottle of spray ink, I figured I should show what you can do with spray ink. This time I was smart and used watercolor paper, and I pulled out a couple different colors of spray ink and then sprayed them down with some clean water. That's more Victoria Velvet, by the way, that if you're wondering what I threw back on. This is me, by the way, looking for a paper towel. I forgot to pull paper towels out. I always lay down and get some of the initial ink off and then go back in with more ink. And here I wanted to have some shine and sparkle, so I pulled out some old Perfect Pearls spray. There's a lot of mica powder sprays out there on the market, though. Pull off the stencil, and this time I was smart enough to use watercolor paper to show you the ghosting effect, or the extra ink effect, when you have the proper paper. So here we go, flip over, and paper towels come out to smush down extra ink. So basically one technique, two completely different cards, which I think is fun. I think the fact that you can make two separate cards very quickly, or two backgrounds for cards very quickly, is fun. Here you see the spray ink, and here you see the extra ink. Again, I will warn you, this project, I was doing so many of these little videos that I didn't always take the time to make sure things were perfectly neat and clean. Those two had cool textures, but weren't necessarily as neat and clean as they could be. Now, you can use watercolors with stencils. I think a lot of people think you can't. And you can obviously lay a stencil down and then paint through the stencil, but I wanted to show you a different technique. Try watercoloring on the stencil, laying watercolor literally onto the plastic. So I've got a piece of clean paper down under the stencil. That's doing nothing but catching the extra ink. It has in no way, shape, or form my card. I've pulled out a paintbrush and I'm just very quickly laying down watercolor. Now, I will tell you, I find this technique works best with watercolors that have a lot of pigment in them. So like a ganache. I always say that wrong. I'm probably saying that absolutely wrong. Don't judge me. Or my Gansai Tambis, which have a more opaque, has more opacity to the pigment, work better with this technique, which is why I'm using the Gansai Tambis. And you see, I'm just laying down a lot of paint onto literally the stencil. Pull out the extra paper, pull out some clean water, and just respray the image. And then I lay the paper onto the stencil. The trick here is not to wiggle the paper around, it's to lay it flat down. But look, you get a very cool image. And because some places didn't fill out quite the way I wanted to, I'm able, because it's wet from the water, go back in and lay down just a little bit more color into those places where the ink is. Like the cloud didn't quite show up, so I was able to create it. I don't know. I think this is fun. I think this gives you another option, spreading your stencils even further. Watercolor markers. You can use them with stencils, whether you knew it or not. Now, I will warn you, I am a watercolor marker addict. I have all kinds. I pulled out a whole bunch of different brands here to show you that all brands work. And again, notice I'm not outlining the stencil. I'm just laying some color down. That's all I'm doing. I am just filling in the zones with color. I'm trying to get kind of a gradiated ombre effect up between blues and purples. It worked. I would have worked better if I'd stuck with one brand, just because things blend differently, but I wanted to show you that all brands of watercolor marker work. And I will tell you, there's a little bit of difficulty with this particular, I love this stencil. Don't get me wrong, love this stencil, but because that tree moves, you have to be very careful when you're laying around the tree and the pumpkin, how careful you are so it doesn't get under the tree. If you want my opinion on what marker works the best with this technique, it's this one. The Spectrum Aquas lay color down gorgeously when you're working with this technique. Again, all of them will work though. My second favorite is probably the Tombow. Now I've laid all this color down and I'm just spraying with some clean water, and I'm once again pulling out just actually this is a really cheap paintbrush. It's not even a watercolor brush. It's like I literally grabbed the cheapest, nastiest brush I own. But I'm just blending the color into each other. And it works. And again, I didn't take really the time I should have to make sure things were laid down and things were as neat as they could be. But you get the gist of what I'm going for here. See how cool that ghosting, like, it's just a different technique. It's just a different style. Now, powdered watercolors, I use Brusho. That's what I have. But they work great with stencils. The key is to make sure the stencil's laid down really well. But you spray it with some clean water and then tap on the powdered watercolor. This actually might be one of my favorite techniques with stencils because there's a texture left behind with the powders. Something that you can't get with a liquid watercolor or a spray. You get this grainy residue, or at least I do because I put so much powder on and not enough water. But that's what I like about it. I like the fact you get this almost invented texture left behind on your watercolor paper. I threw a little bit more water on just to get some of those crystals broken down a little bit more. And again, did not grab a watercolor brush, just grabbed a brush from my style. This one's at least not the nastiest one I own. And tapped. I didn't paint, I tapped in extra water. But look at all that. Can you see that texture? Like, if you were to touch this, you would literally feel the grains. Now, paint, and you can do this with any kind of paint. Paint's great with stencils. I use cheap makeup sponges. I don't use brushes. I hate the pouncing brushes. I've never liked them. But this works if you've got a crafter's paint, acrylic paint. Really, any brand works with this. I'm just using some Delusions because I secretly love the painting out of the lids. It's that simple. And I think a lot of crafters have Delusions paints but don't know how to use them within card making. This is a way. This is actually a phenomenal way to make cards with some of your crafting paint that you have lying around. I went for, again, try to do an ombre effect with the colors here. So I went from a light blue into a dark blue, purple, black. Oh, and if you're wondering what I'm doing to my hand, I hate palettes. I own a couple palettes. I hate palettes. They don't work for me. I tend to knock them off my desk. I just never really been able to. A palette paper kind of works for me. The best palette on the market for me is that it's the back of my hand, especially when I'm working with a sponge, because then my dabbing is right there, and I don't put my. I tend to put my right hand into a lot of paint if I've got it laying around. When it's on the back of my left hand, I don't tend to get it everywhere. So yes, I have paint on the back of my hands. But look how beautiful paint comes out on a card. And then you put a little critter in front of it and you've got a great little card. Now, another phenomenal technique. It's still just paint. It's not a new medium, but it's a whole different look than a sponged on paint. I'm using black paper and just quickly dabbing on some white. You need to create a contrast between what's under the stencil and what's showing through the stencil. So I like to use white, especially on black, before I start splattering. And again, I'm using the back of my hand. Now, when I clean paint off of a stencil, sometimes I don't clean paint off stencils because it dries and it no longer affects me. But if I am going to clean it off a stencil, I don't use a paper towel and a spray bottle of water. I actually have at my kitchen sink a dish cleaning brush just for stencils. My family knows not to use it on plates, but I clean my stencils off in the kitchen sink with a dish cleaning sponge. So okay, here's my palette paper. I mentioned it just a moment ago. This is my palette paper, and this is, if I'm going to use a palette, this is probably what I use more than anything. I put out some just distress paints. I think a lot of crafters have them, but don't know how to use them. Well, here's a fun way to use them in card making. And I'm just tapping the paintbrush. That's it. It's some water, some paint, and me tapping. I'm not quite getting enough paint out, so you'll see me pull out another paintbrush and tap it against the paintbrush here in a second. There you go. And then it sounds like I'm making cool drum noises. My kids actually all use this technique with their artwork because they think it sounds fun. Nothing like making art based on sound. I will warn you, this technique creates a mess. If you don't want it all over your work, you don't want those splatters of paint all over your work surface, save a box and splatter paint within a box. It tends to keep the paint contained if you're splattering into a box. My desk is constantly covered in paint because I am a mixed media artist in addition to a paper crafter. So I have paint everywhere. And in fact, if you've always wondered why my gray mat is always incredibly nasty, it's because I paint on it. I'm not supposed to. It's supposed to be just for card making, but I tend to forget to take it off my desk. And it's time to invest in a new mat. I don't think it's happening anytime soon, but yeah. Look how cool, and yes, I get my hand into the wet paint. But look how cool that comes out. That comes out with a whole different look than just regular paint did. Now here's one of those extra cards that come about because of techniques. I started to clean the stencil off and realized I had all this gorgeous color on it. So I pulled out a piece of watercolor paper and just picked up all this extra paint. You can kind of see the house is still there. The imprint of the witch is up in the corner. I dried it quickly and laid the stencil back down and pulled out again some more paint and just sponged some paint over this leftover splatter paint. And it ends up with this really pretty, ignore it. I have one problem with Illusions paint. You get like the screw jar crusties falling off all the time. And I always forget to open my jars of paint away from my project so the little crusties won't get on my project. Live and learn and then forget. But yes, when you've got extra paint on your stencil, feel free to spray some water on it, pull out some paper, and use it. I do it all the time. But look at that effect. 2 cards in one, again. And it's just, there's some pretty color, and actually, I love the colors that ended up being. For me, one of the coolest techniques with stencils is texture paint. There's a whole bunch of different texture paints or pastes or effects out on the market these days. This is just one set by Prima, but it literally has some sand in the paint. So when you dab it on, especially through a stencil, you get these great, amazing textures coming up from the... I want to say I'm using cardstock here. No, I'm using watercolor paper. I did go ahead and go with a thicker paper because I know how heavy these paints can be. So watercolor paper. But textured paints, if you find some, especially like on clearance, grab them. There's so much fun through a stencil. They just create a completely different effect than, I don't know, anything else I use. There's no acrylic paint out there that can do what these texture pastes are doing. So the key with these is just layering them, especially this brand. This is meant to be layered one on top of another to create this effect. And both the green and the blue have different amounts of texture within them, so they create a different effect. And it's hard to see when you're pouncing, and that's the technical word here, what I'm doing with the sponge is pouncing. Pouncing paint through a stencil, it's hard to see where it's going, but if you play with paint and stencils enough, you kind of know where it's going to end up. My favorite thing about this is this gold color. There is no texture in the gold. It's truly just a metallic. And yes, I'm using the back of my hand as a palette again because that's how I roll in my house. But that gold picks up the texture the other two paints have laid down, thus creating this really neat effect that the paint is designed to do. I don't know, I think of all the different techniques I used, visually this one came out my favorite. There was something very cool about it not being black or blue. I guess it is blue, but not Halloween blue. And then all the texture within the card came out really, really cool. Like I said, of all, there's 20 plus techniques I used today, and I think this one today was hands down my favorite. But look how pretty that is. Didn't that come out pretty? And this paint would also work on black paper, which is also cool. So mica powders. There's a whole bunch of different brands out there on the market. I think I'm just using Perfect Pearls today. I haven't used the Perfect Pearls embossing pad in some time, and I didn't realize it had gone absolutely nasty on me. So it's really gross. Actually, in fact, as soon as I finished stamping with this pad, I threw it in the garbage can. I'm just going to use my good one from now on. But through the stencil, I applied this embossing powder. And then I just took a couple different colors of mica powder and tapped them onto the card. Sadly, this is sped up. I don't know why I was being so very careful with this. Maybe because I hate wasting powder. But I didn't go nearly as quickly as I could and probably should have. And right now, it looks like nothing. It looks like I'm just making a giant mess on my desk, which I would like to note when you're using mica powders, that's in fact exactly what you're doing, is creating a giant mess on your desk. Because no matter how hard you try, the powders get everywhere. This is another case where doing this inside of a box isn't the worst idea in the history of the world, especially if you don't want powder everywhere. But once you get all the powder laid down and you start blending with your brush, the embossing pad, the powder sticks to where you laid the ink down. And this is a really cool, subtle technique. I mean, it's very subtle. It's not going to have the dark colors that other techniques will use. But once you lay it down, again, clean your brush off, and then you can just brush off all the excess. Isn't that fun? I don't know. I think it's fun. And then it's reflective. The other thing with mica powders, once you get them cleaned off, add some water, and the whole thing comes to life. I don't know why the addition of water. I'm not the chemist, but the addition of water makes, especially Perfect Pearls, so much more fun. So there's mica powders laid down. And if you can do mica powders, you can emboss. So I pulled out, and that's not a tool about me, that's the brand name, it's EK if you didn't know it. I pulled out my powder tool, my anti-static tool, and laid down some cardstock and made certain that the cardstock was covered in this anti-static powder. And then using my Versamark, again, just stamped through the stencil. I will tell you on a cautionary note, make certain you clean your stencil right away when you're using embossing powder on it, or your stencil will be sticky for a while. Now, I wish I could tell you what this embossing powder is. I can't. I've had it forever, literally forever. It's been in that plastic tub forever. I use it all the time, and I haven't replaced it in years. And I don't know who makes it, and I don't know what the color is. I just know I like it, and I know if I ever actually run out of it, I'm going to be in a world of trouble because I don't know how to replace it. But embossing leaves really oh, there's me burning my finger. I hope you enjoyed that. Embossing leaves really cool, crisp lines, especially, like, check out that witch. Look at how sharp she is in the moon. So embossing is a really cool technique with stencils. And I don't think many crafters think to use it just because you're not stamping. Molding paste. I am addicted to molding paste. There's a whole bunch of different brands out on the market. The Faber-Castell may be one that crafters are the most familiar with, because it's actually kept in the crafting aisle as opposed to the golden or the Liquitex, which is kept in the fine art aisles. I love molding paste. First of all, it leaves texture. You can build it up. With stencils, it's really cool because it will actually be raised off the paper. I'm just using a black cardstock. It's really actually a completely cheap black cardstock. It's not as thick as I would want it to be. And I can sit and watch people spread molding paste all day long. It's like watching somebody ice a cake. I can sit and do it all day long. For the windows, or most of the windows, and the sidewalk, I pulled out some Ranger texture paste. It's actually not a molding paste. It's a gel, but it's in that same family of acrylic mediums. It does not dry opaque. In fact, it will dry clear, giving it a different look as the molding paste, which will dry completely opaque. So two different looks. Basically, both of them are acrylic mediums. But check out how that stands up off of the card. I love molding paste. It is awesome. And see how different the gloss dries? There's a bunch of new products on the market right now known as mousses. They're really just texture pastes. Nuvo's got some. I pulled out a couple different ones I have. I'm kind of in love with the Nuvo mousse, though, because it's metallic. I'm using the brush that Nuvo put out. It blends gorgeously. Look at, I mean, that background is gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous the way it blends out. I do have a major problem with this brush, though. It sheds like nobody's business. Bristles fall out everywhere. And I've tried a couple other brushes to see if I can get this pretty blending effect, and I can't. So I think I'm going to either have to, well, experiment with more brushes, or just deal with the fact I get little pieces of bristle hair in my Nuvo mousse. I'll let you know when I come to the decision which one I settle on. So I've laid down a really cool background with the mousse here. And then I pulled out a palette knife and a different color of mousse. And then I forgot to lay my stencil down. But there's my stencil. So you can, oh, there's my, if you're wondering, my Post-it note tape, there it was. You got a little quick peek at it. So yeah, the mousse works a lot like molding paste would in terms of leaving texture behind. It raises up. There's definitely a difference between the paper and where the mousse is in terms of texture. But this is different than molding paste in some ways. There's a different effect. I mean, they're both texture paste, but it's different. Maybe it's the metallic within it that does it for me, but I don't know. I think this stuff is cool. It's not nearly, and I will tell you, it is not nearly as easy to spread as molding paste. And there's some of that lovely bristle hair coming out of my jar. Again, really have a problem with how many bristles fall off that brush. But it blends so beautifully. And like I said, I can't find a mop head brush and boar bristles like that that doesn't either shed or doesn't blend as well. Here's a different brand of this mousse out there. This one actually spreads a little smoother than the Nuvo. It doesn't have nearly as much shine or metallic reflection. So there's the difference. I'm not endorsing one or the other. Actually, I am. I like the mousse better, even though this spreads easier. Here's a third brand on the market. This one doesn't spread great, but it actually will keep stiff peaks really well. So if you want to like have some really cool stiff peaks, and yes, you can blend them into each other. But when you pull up the stencil, look at that incredible impression left behind. Seriously, it leaves a really cool effect. Now, one of my favorite techniques out there is CRACKLE, and I went to go grab my favorite brand of CRACKLE, and I am 100% completely out. My favorite brand of CRACKLE, for me, is the Golden CRACKLE paste. It takes forever to dry, but it's so worth the wait. The crazing from Tim Holtz isn't bad, and it actually dries pretty quickly. But the crackle's really, really subtle. But it goes great onto a stencil. It actually goes really, really well onto the stencil, and it doesn't seep under. I pulled out, and I use the Distress Crackle paints on a couple different other projects, but I've never tried it on cardstock. It seeped under the stencil. I'm not crazy with how this particular product worked with the stencil. I use Crackle Medium all the time with stencils, and it works great, leaving wonderful impressions behind. This one just, I don't know if it's too runny, but it didn't do what I was hoping it would do, and thus the example I have of Crackle Paste isn't the one I'd want to show you. But know that Crackle Paste does, there's tons of Crackle Paste out there on the market. And if you let it dry properly, this is one you really shouldn't and can't heat dry. You really need to let Crackle Paste dry on its own. But it leaves a very cool effect out there, especially for card making, especially if you want something like a Halloween or an age or distress card. That crackle effect in the background is very cool. And here's where you see how much that white ran under my stencils. It's not the stencil, it's the product. And yes, there was 2 pieces of black cardstock down. It happens. But when you let it dry, you look at that cool crackle effect. You can see how that would be really, really effective. Now, I didn't know what to call this one, so I called it embellishments. It's probably the wrong word. And I had run out of paper at this point and had a scrap of die cut paper laying on my desk. And I was like, that will work. We'll use that. So yes, here's a sheet of die cut textured cardstock that I'm pressing gel medium through. This is the same kind of gel medium I used earlier in the sidewalk and windows of another example. This is just a different brand. Now I pulled out these embellishments. You can use glitter. This is glass glitter, so it's little reflective glass pieces. I don't think it's really glass pieces, but it looks like glass pieces. And you sprinkle it onto the gel medium. It's that simple. Like I said, glitter. There's so much stuff out there that you can use. I pulled out a different style of flake. These are the MICA flakes. They're really thick. They're almost like little stones. And then you just go in with your finger and you tap down the embellishment or the effect into your gel medium and it will dry. And it doesn't look great yet. Shake off the extra. And ta-da! You have a really cool effective background. Now I wish it wasn't on a piece of die cut paper because that kind of ruined it. And last but not least, you can use a stencil to trace. I had a video problem here, so I lost all but just the beginning of it. But if you take your pencil and just carefully trace around, you can then have your stencil image left onto the paper behind you. Here's an example left over from release week. So what do you do with all these cool backgrounds? Well, here are 10 finalized cards. I colored up some creatures from the Frightfully Sweet and the Zombody stamp set and showed you how to finish the card quickly. Here's the Distress Oxide. The first one was Distress Inks. This next one is from Spray Inks. Powdered Watercolor. And you can see it makes a quick, cool background that you can put your stamped images in front of. The splatter paint comes out cool. Here's that texture paint one that I loved so much. The embossing with its sharp, clean edges. Your molding paste that has the raised textured. And finally, your mousses out there. I hope you enjoyed this massive video. I know it was incredibly long. For those of you who made it to the end, thank you for watching the whole thing. I really, really appreciate it. I really hope this kind of encourages you to play with stencils in a different way, to use stencils and really see how far you can push the backgrounds when you're playing with them. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you want to see more of these kind of things, hit the subscribe button. And play with your stencils. Don't just limit yourself to one medium or one technique. Push them as far as you can.